Hello. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get started in a moment. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Alexandra Gheciu. I am the director of CIPS, Center for International Policy Studies, and a professor here at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And on behalf of CIPS and our school, it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you to the first event that we are hosting this academic year. An event, I'm sure you will agree with me, on one of the most important and pressing issues on the international stage, and that is, of course, the war in Ukraine. I'm sure we are all watching, and as the conflict evolves, its significance, its impact on Ukraine, on the region, and indeed on the entire international community cannot be overstated. Of course, the conflict is still very much in the news. And yet, as I think all of us have seen, it can be quite difficult to get a nuanced, sophisticated analysis of the multiple dynamics, multi-layered effects, and potential future scenarios of the conflict. Well, aren't we the lucky ones? Today, we are very fortunate and privileged to have with us an exceptional panel of very distinguished speakers who can help us go well beyond the headlines and shed light on the many, many dimensions of this conflict. I am deeply grateful to all of them for having accepted our invitation, and I am truly honored to welcome them to CIPS and to our school. And I should add that today's event takes place at a particularly important moment. We have seen that President Zelensky of Ukraine is in the US this week, holding critical talks at the UN and tomorrow in Washington. And surprise, surprise, later this week, we are expecting him for a visit here in Canada. So what a perfect moment for us to come together and engage in a conversation on this important topic. Before going any further, however, I hope you will allow me, on behalf of CIPS and the school, to give voice to the Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call our national capital home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. And now I would like to invite to the floor one of Canada's leading experts in the field of international security, who I am proud to say is also my colleague at the school and at CIPS, Professor Thomas Junot, who has very kindly agreed to come and introduce our panelists. Thomas, thank you so much, and please take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Alexandra. I'm very happy to be here with you only for a couple minutes to introduce our very distinguished panel, as Alexandra just said. As you are all aware, the conversation in Canada on international affairs shifted a bit to India this week, in the past couple of days. But Ukraine, the war, the invasion by Russia remain and will remain extremely important topics. There are interesting parallels, I find, between these events, even though in many ways they are very different. There's been a lot of debate in Canada in the last couple of days, and I have no doubt that it will continue, about the extent of support, perhaps lack of support according to some, that Canada has been receiving from its allies in dealing with Indian foreign interference. So there are clear parallels here between our topic today and the crisis with India right now, notably in terms, from a Canadian perspective, of what does an increasingly multipolar world mean for Canada? What does it mean for our relations with allies? What does it mean in terms of what we can expect from our allies? And perhaps one thing that we tend to neglect on the Canadian side, what should we be expected to contribute to our alliances? So this is a conversation that we will have today, and that we certainly will continue with CIPS and in obviously other fora. So to do that today, we have a tremendous panel with very, very long CVs. When I cut and pasted the bios, I calculated that it would take me 12 minutes to read them, so I will not do that. So these are very short bios for extremely accomplished individuals. So first of all, Carrie Buck, who is a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs with us, and among many senior positions in the government, was our ambassador, Canada's ambassador to the North Atlantic Council, to NATO. Dr. Melita Gabric is currently serving as the ambassador of the European Union to Canada since 2021, following her tenure as the ambassador of Slovenia to Canada since 2018. Yulia Kovalev has been the ambassador of Ukraine to Canada since 2022. Prior to joining the embassy, Ambassador Kovalev held the position of the Deputy Head of Office of the President of Ukraine in charge of economic policy development and IFI coordination. Bogdan Manoiu has served as Romania's ambassador to Canada since 2021. Among many positions before that, he served as presidential advisor for European Affairs and head of the government's Department of European Affairs. Sabine Sparwasser is the ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany, and she has held that position since 2017. She has, interestingly, a very rich Canadian experience, including before that, having served as Consul General in Toronto. Lillian Thompson is also a senior fellow with us at GISPIA, and she retired from Canada's Public Service in 2016 as Director General and Dean of the Canadian Foreign Service Institute, and has had a number of positions in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And finally, Keenan Walper is the CEO of Ghost Risk Management. He is a former infantry officer in the Canadian Forces, where he completed a combat tour in Kandahar. In February 22, Keenan headed to Ukraine, where he became involved in evacuation efforts, and he has gone back to Ukraine multiple times since then. On that, as you can see, this is a very diverse, and experienced panel who will give us a great perspective on the war in Ukraine, and I will hand the floor back to Alexandra.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm just going to stand for a moment so that all of you can see me. With this and with my thanks to Thomas, we are ready to get started. I have asked our distinguished panelists to keep their introductory remarks relatively concise so that we can have time for questions and answers. So there will be a Q&A session. There is a microphone here, and I invite you to already start thinking about your questions to our wonderful panelists. We are going to go in the alphabetical order of the panelists, with one exception. Since we are talking about Ukraine, I think it is perfect for us to invite the Ukrainian ambassador to get us started. And the floor is yours, Ambassador Kovalev. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for hosting us and having this important discussion today here in Ottawa, and thank you all the distinguished guests and colleagues with whom we work here in Ottawa very closely, because the war in Ukraine, they actually, and it's important to start, it's not a crisis or conflict, because usually the conflict involves two parties which have the challenge between each other. It's a war, and it's a full-scale Russian invasion that started on February 24th. But if we remind the history, it started in 2014 when Russia occupied Crimea and eastern part of Ukraine, which is Donetsk and Luhansk region. And to be frank, I think we all together need to learn the lessons from this history. Back in 2014, when Russia illegally invaded and occupied Crimea and part of Ukraine's sovereign territory, unfortunately, the reaction at that time from the global community was very diplomatic, which is usually called deep concerns. But in reality, as we now see the Putin as a dictator and Putin regime assumed it as a green light for the further attempt. And as we see in the history and the global map, it was not only the first time when Russia invaded other country. We can look on Georgia, we can look in Transnistria, we can look what Russia has done in Syria. And when the global international community does not strongly react on such actions, we see, unfortunately, the full-scale invasion with thousands of people died, with billions of dollars of the losses, and with the consequences to the globe, to security for many countries, not only in Europe, but in Euro-Atlantic community. and the other consequences which are far-reaching beyond the European continent. And this is the lesson I think we need to remember when talking today about full-scale Russian invasion. It's not a conflict. Russia invaded during the night of February 21st last year with the clear idea and the goal to erase Ukraine as a sovereign country from the global map. The idea of Russia was to occupy Ukraine, Ukraine's capital, to take control over Ukraine's capital and to impose the Muppet government in Ukraine as they considered they are able to do, and just erase the sovereign country. This is not only the question of Ukraine as a sovereign country. The world has lived and was able to develop both the bigger countries who are strong economies, who are strong military power, big in terms of their population and territory, peacefully together with smaller countries, less economically developed, weaker in terms of their military, only because there was the international rule and rule-based order, which guaranteed each sovereign country the respect of its sovereign borders. The other thing I want to remind you then, when Ukraine refused from the third biggest in the world nuclear weapon stock, Ukraine was guaranteed by Budapest Memorandum, where Russia was one of the signatories, the security of Ukraine and its sovereign borders. That is a lesson we all need to remember, especially talking about the future of the war and some countries that still proceed with different kind of the peace plans, some compromises. Unfortunately, with dictator regimes, these compromises only lead to the future aggression. The same is with the international institutions, as this week is very important week of UNGA meetings, which are happening in New York these days. There are a lot of important and tough discussions which have their roots in Ukraine and which have their roots on what is happening in Ukraine. We see Russia, an aggressor country, who brutally breached UN Charter, and over 140 countries supporting the relevant UN resolutions stated and supported it is really brutal invasion. Unfortunately, the UN and its Security Council cannot be operational because Russia, being a permanent member of Security Council with its veto right, does not allow the UN as an organization to proceed with the goal that it was created to proceed, and which is to preserve peace and to preserve the rule-based order. And we welcome these discussions, which are very important not only for Ukraine, but which are very important for each of us living here in Canada, living around the world. And I think we will have today a lot to talk about what is happening in Ukraine, what could be the implications and what are the implications. But I want to start with a very probably tough and direct message. We need to win this war. We need to win this war not only for the sake of Ukraine as independent country, but we need to win this war, and Russia need to learn a very tough lesson of being defeated in order to ensure that the world is the safe place, that food cannot be used as a weapon, that energy cannot be used as a weapon, that nuclear power cannot threaten other countries, that all of the war crimes and the crime of aggression cannot be left unpunished. That is important to prevent other conflicts in this very turbulent world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Very powerful and moving statement. And can I now invite Ambassador Kerry back to please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Deshu. I will briefly look at the war in Ukraine, war against Ukraine from 5 feet, from my own personal voyage from the beginning of the war, and then from 50,000 feet, what I think it means. So from 5 feet away, my personal journey began, as for the people of Ukraine, back in 2014. And in 2014, we all know it was midday in Ottawa when I got a call from the Prime Minister's foreign policy advisors saying, go and look at the intel. and unmarked, uninsigniated men in Russian army uniforms that weren't visibly Russian, but had the same make, model, etc., were rolling into Crimea in numbers not seen for a long time, positioning themselves at the airport and at the legislature. And then on March 18th, Vladimir Putin presided over a ceremony at the Kremlin, illegally declaring Crimea Russian territory. For me, that was the beginning of the war. It was a surprise. We had downed tools a bit too much on our intelligence capacities in Russia, and too many of us were surprised. But because I was Canadian political director at the time, I had a front row seat to the reactions of the G7 and NATO and UN allies to Russia's violation of Ukrainian borders. And I agree with you, Ambassador, that the response was much too weak. But given where we were just before the war, I'm not defending the response, it was too weak. It didn't act as a deterrent. But given where the world was right before 2014, I was actually pleasantly surprised at how strong the international community response had been. So what did it look like prior to 2014? If you walked into the NATO cafeteria, you would see Russian military sitting having lunch with NATO soldiers at the NATO cafeteria. Russia had worked with NATO on a number of issues, including facilitating transit of NATO goods into Afghanistan. The NATO-Russia Council was alive and well with 17 sub-bodies and a lot of cooperation happening. And Putin had even said years earlier in an interview with the BBC, and this is a quote, "Russia's part of Europe. I cannot imagine my own culture in isolation from Europe. It's hard for me to visualize NATO as an enemy. I would not even rule out the possibility of Russia joining NATO." Pre-2014. Right, that was then. And yet here we are today, more than a year and a half after Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. So I won't get into the details of the trajectory of the war, but I will say now, my 50,000 feet, what I think this means for the world and why it is so important, as the ambassador said, that this war be won. What winning looks like is not clear. That's the problem right now, right? I see the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a hinge of history, development so significant that it rearranges all of the building blocks of the international order. And in some ways, the last year and a half has been a test of the international community to see if it can respond with sufficient unity and purpose to protect the values that the post-war order was built on. I think it's too early to determine whether that test has been passed yet, unfortunately. So far, so good, but I hesitate to even go that far. So far, the West's resolve in NATO unity has been impressive. Jens Stoltenberg said NATO is now stronger than it has ever been. But will this hold? I see several areas where fault lines could emerge in the medium term. First, this is the test case, I think, of something that has been happening for a while in other areas of the world, and that is authoritarian governments staging a challenge against global democracy that is unprecedented since 1945. And decisions made over the next few years will shape the world as we know it for decades. Decisions that we make on Ukraine will be about much more than Ukraine. Second, one of the existential questions the West will need to address is how to deal with a post-war Russia. At some point, the war will end, and I can't predict how or when. As I said, what winning looks like, I don't think there's consensus on that. And it's Ukraine's call, to be frank. If Russia is completely defeated by Ukraine and loses even Crimea, it's hard to see how Putin can remain in power. But after years of defenestrations still ongoing, mysterious suicides, poisonings, lengthy jail sentences, there are no rivals or heirs waiting in the wings behind Putin. A dangerous vacuum could emerge. That's not a rationale for wanting Putin to stay in place, not by 1 inch, but we have to be aware of what the next phase of Russia and face of Russia might look like. Alternatively, any scenario less than full Ukrainian victory could result in Putin staying in power. And as the world learned after 2014, Putin will try again. He has an unpredictable track record. We were unable to predict it, but it follows a certain logic. And I think if there's one predictable thing about his leadership, like Russia, will likely continue to have an ongoing destabilizing political and economic impact in Europe. And the West will have to be ready to deal with unified strategies with a wounded Russia after the war. The Russian war has also had an impact on the effectiveness of multilateral institutions. As President Zelensky said, when he's very critical of the UN Security Council, where is the security? And the fault lines built into the Security Council from the beginning, notably the veto assigned to the 5 permanent members, including Russia and China, have been laid bare. Some have even said that the UN Security Council is dead. But I don't think that means the UN is dead. Maybe the Security Council is facing its own League of Nations moment, okay? But imagine the response to Ukraine without the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Food Program, or without International Criminal Court or the Commission of Inquiry created by the UN Human Rights Council. NATO's fared much better, I think, than the UN. Strong and unified political positions, capacity to really ramp up the support to Ukraine. It's not enough yet. And my biggest fear on NATO is that consensus will break. I don't think that the breaking of consensus flows mostly from some of the problems around Turkey and Hungary with, for instance, Sweden and earlier Finland's leadership. I think if you look to the south, the risk of Trump or a Trump adjacent leader coming into power in the US could act as a real juggernaut, wrecking any reasonable approach to multilateral responses to Russia. I'm very worried about that. And I know that the Russian leadership at least is banking on the timing of the American presidential leadership. And then finally, the West also needs to worry about building bridges to the global South. The strong initial reaction of the whole world to Russia's illegal invasion was good. That has only been sustainable with really, really consistent diplomacy, and you saw it start to fall apart at the last G20 meeting. So with that, I've talked too long. Sorry, Alexandra.
Oh, thank you so much. What an amazing tour de force. You've given us so much to think about. But for now, let me please invite Ambassador Marita Gabric to please take the floor.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for the invitation and for putting together this important gathering. So when I was thinking about what to say, what my message is, I realized that my message has not changed a bit since the beginning of this brutal war against Ukraine, against Ukrainians that are fighting so courageously and with such a sacrifice for their freedom, for democracy, and for the right to choose their destiny. The messages: Ukraine has the European Union and its member states' full support. And these are not just words. I will tell you a little bit about what we are doing and in support of Ukraine. And I will do this in order for you to have a sense of how Europe is really united and understands very well how important it is that Ukraine prevails and wins this war. So just a week ago, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union address, said what she's been saying from the very beginning. We are going to be with Ukraine at every step of the way, and we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And as I say, these are not just words. You know, sometimes we hear criticism, oh yeah, these are words. What does it mean? What does it mean? It means that, for example, in terms of financial aid, the EU so far and its member states contributed. So it would be about 120 billion in Canadian dollars for financial support, for macro financial support, for also the EU, for the first time in its history, came up with a package of military support for Ukraine. We are building on this. We are going ahead with this. We also devised this training, military training mission actually, Canada, I have to give credit here to Canada, was so important through its, I forgot now what the mission was
Unifier.
called, the significant contribution that Unifier had on the preparedness of the Ukrainians to to defend themselves when this invasion happened now. Well, it seems like a very long time ago. So when it started. So now we are doing it, and so far we already trained 25,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and our goal is to go up to 40,000 by the end of the year. And of course, humanitarian assistance, of course, we are helping Ukrainians. We have 4 million Ukrainian refugees in the EU, on the territory of the EU. And just last week, all these guarantees of temporary protection were extended. That means that all these refugees have the right to protection, to schooling, to healthcare, and so forth, to access to the job market, healthcare. So, and also very importantly, and Ambassador Bach mentioned also the political side of things, the outreach to the global South. So here we have to do more. We are very proactive in this, and we are also working with Canada closely on, making other countries, especially so-called wedging countries or countries in between, to understand what it means that there is an aggression by one country against its neighbor. What does that mean for other countries? What kind of precedent does this constitute? What does this mean for the international law? What does this mean for our international order? So that is a very important part of our action right now. But I would also want to say that as we are working on the longer term security guarantees for Ukraine, so we are thinking about all these building blocks, and I would put that I mentioned, meaning support, financial support, but also sanctions, isolation of Russia, outreach to the global South, all these building blocks, but one and military support. But one building block that I would especially emphasize is also the perspective of Ukraine to become the EU member. So as of 23rd of June last year, Ukraine is actually a candidate country. There is this accession process that every country that at the end of the day exceeds the EU needs to go through. It is that process means that the country has to go through a number of reforms, notably in judicial reforms or the rule of law in general reforms and so forth. And I have to say that as difficult as it is for Ukraine to just sustain this level of defense that they have been demonstrating, Ukraine actually managed to do a significant progress in its reforms in a number of areas. And so we are very pleased that this process is ongoing, and that the fact that Ukraine is considered a candidate country, has the status of candidate country, that means that we see the future of Ukraine in the European Union. So perhaps, I don't know, maybe just to mention in terms of long-term security guarantees, I would also mention accountability. That is something that the EU is, obviously, we are very much invested in. We think that long-term stability and peace will not be possible without a proper accountability of Russia for this war of aggression. There are still some conversations, some negotiations going on regarding how exactly, what exactly, this accountability would look like, meaning what kind of international body should be and will be established to make Russia accountable for its war of aggression. But make no mistakes, we are 100% committed to make Russia pay for its war of aggression against Ukraine. So I think that I will stop right here. I have no idea. there is no clock, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Truly important, and clearly the EU is playing and will continue to play a vital role for Ukraine. And speaking of the European Union, I would like to invite to the floor the Ambassador Bogdan Monoiu, who of course represents a country that is very close to the conflict, Romania. So Ambassador, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Dieciu. Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I think it's very timely. I'm so sorry I didn't bring a map. So I don't know if you know where Romania is. It's like a fish, really, like that, bordering the Black Sea, and we have Ukraine to our north. We, both of us, Ukraine and Romania, are riparian to the Black Sea. And this is one of the topics I will approach. Now, the intervention of Ambassador Kovalev gave me some ideas. I scribbled something on my paper. Let us not forget that the war began, yes, in 2014 with Crimea. But we had signs of the deterioration of the security situation in the Black Sea in 2008. And in 2008, Romania hosted the NATO summit. So we had signs. It took some time for the West to mobilize. As a practitioner in international relations, what I will try to do is to put forth what Romania is trying to achieve as an individual actor or as part of international organizations, starting with NATO and the EU. I will begin by stating the obvious, as Ambassador Kovalev did. So Ukraine is fighting a war for its own territorial integrity. And this cannot be stressed enough, as it is essential in understanding that the fight the brave Ukrainian people are pursuing is just and legitimate. Why I'm stressing just and legitimate? Because this is the backbone of our talks with countries worldwide, especially in the global south, to what end? To build what Ambassador Kovalev said, the reaction, and to maintain this reaction against the Putin regime. We continue to stand with Ukraine as we stood from the very first day of the gruesome Russian war of aggression, in full solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. It is my country's position to stand for the rules-based international order, for respecting international law, and for respecting the independence, sovereignty, and freedom of nations. This is to say that we uphold the Ukrainian people's right to freely decide their own future without any foreign interference. This is why Romanian support for Ukraine is firm and will last until Ukraine achieves final victory. Romania decided to act in support of Ukraine on several directions. First, direct support and assistance. Second, advancing our own contributions in forging collective responses, especially through its membership in NATO and the EU, both in terms of support to Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. We used several other platforms to advance support for Ukraine, such as the trilateral Romania, Ukraine, Moldova, or the security format for coordination called Bucharest 9 or B9. And thirdly, pursuing an active diplomatic engagement worldwide to promote the mobilization of support for Ukraine in the fight against the Russian aggressor. I will refer to just a few facets of the support granted to Ukraine. This falls under the first line of action. Support for the people and industry of Ukraine with fuel, electricity, and electric generators, the provision of safe haven and protection for refugees coming from our neighbor. Over 6 million Ukrainians already crossed our borders. This doesn't mean they all stayed in Romania. Support for Ukraine's economy by facilitating exports of grain, especially to those regions vulnerable from a food security point of view. For your information, more than 25.5 million tons of Ukrainian grain were exported via Romania. With reference to our role in collective endeavors, I would like to point out the following. Romania supports Ukraine's European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations. We strongly support the adoption of the political decision allowing for the opening of accession negotiations to the EU by the end of the year. International sanctions are an effective tool if we coordinate on 3 levels: adopting sanctions, implementing them, and taking anti-circumvention measures. In this context, we are in favor of finding a sound legal base to use frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's reconstruction. Finally, the international efforts to hold accountable all those responsible for crimes committed in Ukraine must continue. We support the pursuit of international justice and accountability. A special place in our diplomatic démarches pursued from the top of our political hierarchy was and is reserved to the Black Sea region, at this very moment profoundly affected by the war of aggression conducted by Russia. Romania constantly advocated systematically since 2008 that the Black Sea needs more global attention. The Black Sea is of strategic importance for transatlantic security and requires a solid allied posture of defense and deterrence, but it is also an area of trade with essential commodities, such as grain of Ukrainian origin. Now, the summit in Vilnius advanced significantly in this direction. The Black Sea has a specific chapter in the final communique. This is also a way to attract and to maintain to attract the interest and maintain the Black Sea in the top priority of the alliance. The trade with grain was and still is disturbed by the Russian aggression, but important steps were taken to alleviate the consequences generated far beyond the limits of the Black Sea on food security. I'm referring to the EU solidarity lanes, which facilitated Ukrainian grain exports to countries in the global south. By terminating the Black Sea Grain Initiative and by attacking Ukrainian ports, certainly you have read in the papers, Russia further exacerbates the global food crisis. And this is the correct narrative. Russia exacerbates the global food crisis, leading to more pressure on countries already vulnerable to severe shortages in the global south. Last but certainly not least, Romania fully supports the Ukrainian peace formula of President Zelensky as the most suitable framework conducive to a fair, lasting, and sustainable peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for this very important regional perspective. I think we all need to understand much more about the Black Sea than we do, so we are grateful for your insights. And now, of course, we continue with another very important voice from the European Union, the German Ambassador, Ambassador Sabine Sparwasser. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I don't need to do anything, it works, right? Thank you so much. I think I can be really brief because a lot of what I planned on saying has been said by the excellent speakers before me, and I can pick up a few points. First of all, I think the point of the legitimacy of Ukraine defending its sovereignty, its liberty, its independence against the brutal Russian attack is obvious to all of us. But we really need to underline that Ukraine is fighting for the principles of the UN Charter that we all subscribe to. And I think it was poignant to see President Zelensky addressing the UN General Assembly about that yesterday. I want to pick up on Bogdan's point because Russia's war of aggression is causing hunger, devastation, it's causing debt and poverty across the world. This is a huge suffering in Ukraine, but it is actually spreading all over the world. And I think we need to look at that as well. Carrie made the point very well. We don't know where things are going, but we all want peace. And my chancellor has just spoken yesterday at the UN General Assembly, and I find that quote really important, so I wanted to share it with you. He said, "We should beware of phony solutions which represent peace in name only." Yes, we all want peace, no one more than Ukrainians, but we should beware of phony solutions. For peace without freedom is called oppression. Peace without justice is called dictatorship. And then Russia is responsible for this war, and is Russia's president who can end it at any time with one single order. And I think we need to keep that in mind. My second point would be just very briefly, what has happened in Germany? You know, Germany was a country with a strong, and for good reason, good historical reason, with a strong, if you want, even pacifist streak. 2 days, and that's 1.5 years ago, and it seems to me like an eternity. 2 days after the attack on Ukraine, Germany's policy shifted 180 degrees. Our foreign and security policy, our energy policy, I would argue our total economic policy. We suddenly started giving not just help to Ukraine, we gave military weapons, which we would have refused beforehand. We accepted to raise our, we actually put 100 billion in order to equip our military better, something we wouldn't have done beforehand. We went out within a year out of our dependency, which was at 55% of Russian gas and oil. And we made a huge effort to support Ukraine in every possible way, from the military to helping the refugees. So by now, Germany is, after the United States, the second largest donor for Ukraine. More than 1 million Ukrainians have found a temporary or forever home in Germany. 250,000 children go into our schools. And we have been delivering, and we keep delivering, and we keep announcing and looking for more to produce and more to deliver on the ammunition front, in particular also when it comes to help Ukraine defend its cities and defend or protect its cities' air defense systems. We have delivered the famous Leo 2. We do have history. So we have been trying to do everything in order to help Ukraine withstand the onslaught and help Ukraine make Russia lose, because in the end, Russia has to lose this war. That's where we stand.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for helping us. It's truly important to understand the vital role played by Germany and the remarkable changes that have taken place in your country since the start of the invasion. So thank you for that. And let me invite my colleague, Dean Lillian Thompson, to please give us her perspective as someone who knows very well Russia. And that's not something we can say for many people. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the kind words. And thank you to my predecessors in speaking for covering a lot of ground so that I don't have to. I'll begin by saying, since by way of explanation, since my colleague Carrie Buck and friend Carrie started with some personal remarks, I will do so as well. Despite the blue eyes and the now technically assisted blonde hair, I am not from the region. My parents were Danish immigrants to Canada, so the bloodlines are Danish on both sides. That being said, I developed a strong interest in Russia as a 12-year-old, first through ballet, at which I was very bad, and then through classical piano, at which I was significantly better. In fact, my final teacher at the Royal Conservatory in Toronto, who went on to be who was at the same time the head of the music department at U of T, was a Ukrainian named Andrew Markov, who sadly now deceased, who had studied graduate of both the Kiev Conservatory and the Moscow Conservatory. So like many people with an interest in Russia, the initial impulse was cultural and also obviously literature. I don't think, it's a basic point, I don't think we've ever really done enough work to even attempt to understand Russia. And I will explain a little bit. There's a famous quote by Winston Churchill at the outset of the Cold War, when he said in a speech, I think it was somewhere in Ohio at an American university, that the Soviet Union, as it then was a riddle inside a mystery, inside an enigma. In a subsequent interview in discussing Kremlin politics, he said that trying to explain Kremlin politics in the Soviet Union, the best imagery was two bulldogs fighting under a rug. There'd be a lot of growling, and eventually the bones of one of the dogs would have emerged, the other one having, of course, won the struggle. So those are two famous quotes. And more recently, I read a number of books over the summer, as one does. I read Serhiy Plokhy's masterful histories. Plokhy is a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard University and probably the most distinguished and academic writer of very readable, which is not always the case, histories. And he talks at length about the history of Ukraine is in and of itself fascinating. But he also talks about, the need for knowledge and more careful study. And careful study of Russia has seen better days than it's seeing right now. Secondly, another interesting volume I read is Martin Sixsmith. Sixsmith is a British journalist turned academic who's written a very interesting history of the Cold War called The War of Nerves. And in it, he extensively interviews people such as Jack Matlock, the former American ambassador in Moscow, refers the works of George Kennan. And again, what comes through again and again is just how much we don't know. But I want to move forward very quickly on a sort of forward-looking note, because next year, it's kind of stating the obvious to say that next year is going to be challenging. There's the electoral quagmire that was going to undoubtedly emerge south of us. The war will undoubtedly continue. And there are risks and there are dangers. And one recent thing I thought I'd refer to, because I'm also teaching a course here on diplomacy, is an article which appeared in Foreign Affairs Online a week ago by Michael Kimmage. Kimmage was the head of the Russia desk under the last 2 years of President Obama's presidency. And his piece is called, Will the West Abandon Ukraine? So I'm just going to paraphrase what he writes. So his question is, he says, if support for Ukraine fades in Europe, but not in the United States, Russia would produce the divide and conquer approach. I think that's actually fairly obvious. They'd pick off various countries in Europe, depending on interests and where they thought they could exercise the most influence. It might propose a faux negotiated settlement, a pause in the fighting, or the poison pill diplomacy of the kind they practiced after the Crimea was taken in 2014, when it gave the impression of being open to compromise, but was in fact seeking to take over Ukraine. So Europe at odds with the United States, for reasons he doesn't go into, a Europe at odds within itself would be an excellent playing field for Russian efforts through manipulation and espionage to normalize the absorption of Ukrainian territory into Russia. A loss of support from the United States, but not in Europe, would have the dramatic effect of implication for supply of military goods. The American military commitments apparently match all of the EU's combined military pledges. I'm not talking about other kinds of aid. So he concludes by saying Western indifference and impatience are Putin's ultimate weapons in this war. Without them, he faces a strategic dead end. So I think that's important, but I want to end on a more positive note or a more encouraging note. In a presentation at U of T on Monday, Timothy Garton Ash, who's a very distinguished European historian, spoke to the war in Ukraine. And totally, I think everyone, we're all agreed here, certainly I am, Ukraine has to win. I mean, that's the sort of non-starter. And he ended by referring to a word I at one point spoke pretty good Polish and pretty good Russian. I've never spoken Ukrainian except by accident. And he referred to a word which is apparently unique to the Ukrainian language, which is volia. And volia means freedom plus willpower. And I think the message there is very clear. To sustain the freedom it's going to take and build Ukraine back, and as an independent, fully sovereign nation, it's going to take a lot of willpower on the part of all of us. So I'll end on that note.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for these thought-provoking remarks. Really appreciate it. And last but certainly not least, I will invite Mr. Kieran Wolper to bring us a different perspective as someone who has spent time in Ukraine and can tell us the difficult, sometimes I assume personal details of what's happening and what the conflict actually means on the ground. So thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge I'm definitely the least qualified person here to speak on policy. So I hope I can bring more of a human view that sometimes the policy can lack. It can be very clinical at times. I know I have been in academia through my master's degree and whatnot, and sometimes we speak of policy, but we forget what's really at stake at the very end of that policy. I entered Ukraine the first week of the war, relatively ignorant of the current situation. I'd been involved in the Afghanistan evacuations pretty heavily. But I had read a book by Timothy Snyder called The Bloodlands. And I was aware of what Russia is capable of doing to human beings on a large scale and what they have done to Ukraine in very recent memory. There are grandparents who are still in Ukraine today who would recall those times of horror at the hands of Russian policy. When I entered into Ukraine, it was obviously very chaotic, as you imagine, and I experienced first off, the lines you saw perhaps on TV of thousands of people fleeing. And as I helped them out moving their suitcases, their entire families moving their suitcases. I've been involved in Afghanistan evacuations. You've seen images around the world of evacuations, refugee camps. These were tech workers, bankers fleeing from a city like Kyiv. Kyiv looks no different than, it could be Ottawa in many places. It could be Toronto. And they're fleeing, no idea what to do, in absolute panic. And I had to wake up pretty quick to what the situation was. I went deeper and deeper to the country I've been there over 40 times since. I'm there, I'd say every single month. And I've watched Ukraine, thanks to the policies and the support from the West, and primarily, and I'd say 99% due to the will of the Ukrainian people and the bravery that I've never seen bravery like this in my entire life. I've never seen humans be so resolved to winning, to preserving what they believe they deserve. And what they deserve is democracy. They deserve freedom. They deserve the ability to live their lives without constant fear of Russian aggression. And what does that look like on the ground? Imagine every 2 hours, air raid sirens are blaring out across Ottawa. Every 2 hours, every hour. They sound like the doomsday sirens you can imagine in your dreams, all over the country, no matter where you are. And depending on where you are in that country, within Ukraine, within 5 to 45 minutes, a missile or a swarm of drones is going to fly over your city and crash into hospitals, office buildings, like we've seen in Kyiv, apartment blocks across the country. And I've seen this all very firsthand. I've seen the havoc wreaked in Kyiv, the highway destroyed by the Russian attack on Kyiv. Imagine if you will, the 417. Picture the entire 417 all the way to Arm Prior, absolutely destroyed in an attempt to get to Parliament Hill. These are real people, and real sons and daughters died defending up to that point. I've been in the hospital wards with the children. I've evacuated children with cancer, children who've been hit in the head with my Russian artillery. I can't, it's unfathomable to me. So when we talk about policy, this is what the policies are working towards to end this madness. As a former military commander, I would never call a soldier or another commander in a Russian army I would never call them a soldier for engaging in this type of behavior. They are butchers. They indiscriminately target children. There is no targeting to these missiles, despite what may be proclaimed. There are civilian casualties. This is indiscriminate attacks that I've seen. But Ukraine is winning. And to the ambassador of Ukraine's point, they have to win, and they are winning. Because when I first arrived in February, it certainly didn't look like they were winning. There was chaos. The jury was definitely out. There was obviously huge parts of the country occupied. There was checkpoints at every 100 meters. There was military everywhere. Today, you can go into Ukraine, and in a large portion of the country, you can move about freely. There are children going to camp. There is life going on, despite, much like the keep calm and carry on you've heard of in London. Ukrainians have used their resolve and their willpower to continue moving forward. They will win this war with continued support. There is no doubt. I don't care what you hear about counteroffensives, faltering. They're winning. But they're not winning at no cost. If you talk about a counteroffensive, we talk about in sweeping terms. A counteroffensive means thousands of young men and women marching towards landmines and machine gun fire and drones. These are not, and we call them soldiers because they're wearing a uniform, but 14 months or 18 months ago, 19 months ago, even maybe 2 months ago, a month ago, depending when they were drafted, these were civilians. The majority of these people. These are civilians being forced into a meat grinder, which is absolutely unfathomable to the typical Canadian. But Ukraine looks so much like Canada. I cannot overstate that enough. In the way that people think, in the cities, in the country, you could be in Saskatchewan. When you look at the fields of Ukraine, you could be in Saskatchewan. Perhaps that's why so many Ukrainians move there. I don't know. Ukraine has captured my heart in a way I fully didn't expect. It has my commitments till the very end, and it is so important that the support that's coming from the European countries is continued, and from Canada, it has to continue. This is a no-fail task for humanity. We've seen what happens in World War II. We've seen what happens when you do not follow through. This is not a very complicated, it's not very complicated to see the parallels between past history and present. And the map of Romania was brought up. Look at the map of Ukraine where it is. If you don't care about Ukraine, do you care about Europe? It's on Poland's doorstep. Poland is on Germany's doorstep. It's right there. And when you cross that line from Poland into Ukraine, you cross that border, you're not crossing an imaginary 10-mile gap. These are the same place in so many ways. And I really hope the support of all the nations that are supporting now continue, and just do not forget why they're doing this, why these policies matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this moving account. Thank you so much for reminding us that this is not just about geopolitics, but it is about human lives. It is about individual and collective tragedies, but also about incredible stories of resilience. And I think we all need to keep in mind. And thank you on behalf of many Canadians in this room for everything that you have done in Ukraine, risking your own life to help others. And that is something that is extraordinary. So thank you. And can I please invite all of you to thank all our wonderful panelists with a round of applause before we move to the Q&A session.